Hello class again, and welcome to this particular video. And in here we're going to explore the properties of quadrilaterals. And in our previous video we talked about different forms of angles determined either by corresponding angles to alternate angles, and how that influences the interior and exterior angles of different polygons. And in here we're going to focus mainly on part 2 of the properties of two-dimensional figures, and our goal is to be able to actually identify the types of quadrilaterals by using the following strategies. One is by using the diagonal properties. Next is by going from the median to the mid segment within a specific shape of a quadrilateral, and next and finally is using the bimedian to determine the centroid of a quadrilateral. So the big question here is, what is a quadrilateral? So what a quadrilateral is mainly noticing that you have 4 sides, 1 and 2, you have 4 interior angles. These two must actually exist in any 2D figure shape for that to indeed be a quadrilateral. Now, examples of all includes the 5 shapes that we've seen right here, and these 5 shapes, they do have 4 sides and they have 4 angles, as we notice on each of them. And this other shape right here, we're going to talk about it in detail and how this is associated with the 4 sides and 4 interior angles, as we see right here. Now the big question here is, what are these 2D quadrilaterals? And this actually comes down to the categories of associating quadrilaterals in terms of the equal line sides. And looking at these 6 particular shapes right here, which are all quadrilaterals, they have 4 sides and 4 angles. We're going to see which ones share the same number of lengths and which one doesn't. We recognize that these 2 shapes, first the green and the yellow, they both have all sides to be equal to each other. So we see that all 4 lengths here, they are equal here, which is signified because we know that as well, because we have one stroke lines or the same stroke lines on the 4 sides. That is the hint to make you all recognize that they have all sides to be equal to each other. So that is one thing to remember here. And this one here, which involves these 3 shapes where you have the orange, the blue and the gray, we do recognize that the first 2 shapes here, which are the orange and the blue, they have 2 opposite sides to have the same length, and we have the 2 opposite sides for the gray, this side and the other side, to also be equal in length as well. And looking back at the orange and the blue, we see that the 2 other opposite sides are equal to each other, equal in length but different in length from the horizontal 2 lines right there. That is why you see that there are different number of strokes on the lines that you see right there, 2 the same, 2 different. So that is also applicable in here, which leads to the conclusion that the 2 shapes right here, the orange and the blue, they have 2 opposite pair sides to be equal in length. And when we look at this other shape right here, we recognize that only one of the opposite pairs length are actually equal, which we see right there, and the 2 other sides, they don't have the same length. So we see that because the top one has 2 strokes, which is different from the bottom line, which has 3 strokes, which means that those 2 lines aren't equal to each other. And finally, G, which is a gray shape, which is associated with the E shape gray, shows that by just looking at it without getting a ruler, that all 4 sides aren't equal to each other. So this leads to the conclusion that in this particular case we have categories of equal length sides where we have all sides to be equal versus two opposite pair sides to be equal in length to one opposite pair sides to be equal and none of the sides to be equal to each other. And this is the conclusion for the equal length of a particular quadrilateral. Now the next one is categorizing quadrilaterals by parallel lines. What do we mean by parallel lines with respect to these particular shapes right here? And we're going to pick the orange and the green shape, and we're going to first explore what it means for the lines to be parallel to each other. For the orange shape, we see here that all the lines here, not all of them are actually equal in length. We know that the two opposite pair sides are equal to each other. Now, speaking of parallel lines, we need to recognize the symbol that represents two lines that are parallel or more to each other. We see that by the representation of arrows, and if two arrows are present, or if we have arrows present on both lines, it means that those lines are parallel to each other. They move in the same direction. They are pointing in the same direction. Another way of looking at that. And so coming in here, we see that why those two lines are parallel to each other, because they share the same transverse line, which shows an alternate angle association with those two lines represented as alpha. We have these other two lines to be parallel to each other, which is represented by this particular beta angle that is equal to each other. So in conclusion here, we see that in here the alpha plus beta angle, which is equal to the angle of a straight line, it's equal to 180 degrees. And once we move on to this other shape, which is green, which shows through the length that all four sides are equal, we see that these two lines are parallel to each other, and this is associated with the transverse line that shows that these angles here are equal, and these two lines here that are shown with the purple arrows are also parallel to each other, and that is associated with the angle which shows that beta are actually equal in angles. So we see here that in conclusion that the both opposite pairs are actually parallel to each other for the orange shape and the green shape. And now moving on to the next shapes that we're going to compare is the blue shape and the yellow shape. The blue shape, we notice that two opposite sides are equal to each other in length, which is shown by this and that over there. So looking at this in terms of the parallel lines, we see that this line is parallel to that line, and that is shown by the angle that is made, which is an alternate angle 90 degree to the transverse line, and we see the other side to be parallel to this other side right here, and we notice that that actually forms a 90 degree angle as well. And we notice in conclusion that this shape forms a 90 degree with all edges of this particular shape right here, and we see that two opposite sides are actually parallel to each other in terms of pairs. So once we look at that, let's move on to this yellow shape right here. We know that all sides are equal, and looking at those two lines, they are parallel to each other and they form 90 degree angle with the transverse line. And we also see that these two lines here, they are parallel to each other, which also forms a 90 degree angle with the parallel line. So in conclusion, we actually come to our observation that these two shapes as well, they both have opposite pairs that are actually parallel to each other. So looking at the next shapes here, which involves E and G, that are both gray, we notice by the length measurements that while these two lines are equal to each other, these two lines here aren't equal to each other. but looking at those two horizontal lines, they are parallel to each other. So in this case, we can actually prove that through the angles, they are alternate to the transverse line or using the same transverse line. So in here we see also that the angle which is better is actually equal to each other, which is actually the sum of those angles to be equal to 180 degrees, because the two angles which is beta and alpha, they are sharing the same straight line right there. So we know that this other shape right here, which is G gray, all sides are not equal to each other, which is seen by the different stroke lines associated with the different lines. However, we see that these two lines as well are parallel to each other. Therefore, if you look at our conclusion that since all sides are not equal, that means all angles are not equal to each other. Therefore, since we have for the two gray shapes only one pair that are parallel to each other, it means that they are under the same category of shapes based on the parallel sides. So looking at it in terms of diagonal lines, this is one thing you need to take note of. In terms of diagonal lines, these are line segments that are joining two vertices of a polygon where these vertices are not on the same edge. So an example is this particular shape. We have this particular diagonal line that cuts through two vertices that are not on the same edge, and we have this also applied to the other vertices right there. So we see here that these two sides here are equal in length, and these two sides here are equal in length in here. And looking at the green shape as well, we have the diagonal line and the other diagonal line. In this case, we have two diagonal lines. We have these two lines equal, and we have these two lines equal to each other. But there's something that is unique in terms of where the two diagonal lines meet. They meet at a point that is actually forming an angle that is 90 degrees. Please take note of that. That is a key important information we need to categorize another style of shapes. So this one here, we notice that we have a diagonal line crossing to the edges and the vertices that are not of the same edges, which we see here that based on the length, all four length diagonal parts are actually equal to each other. And looking at this shape right here, which is the yellow one, we see that these two diagonal lines, they meet at a point. But before we talk about the point, we know that all four length sides are equal, but we see that at that point they form an angle of 90 degrees as well as the green shape where we see above it. So that's another information to take note of. We have two shapes that has diagonal lines that form an angle of 90 degrees. Let's see this particular shape right here. We have also two diagonal lines, they meet at a point, but we recognize that while these two lengths are equal, these two lengths are also equal to each other as well, but they are different line length because the length one stroke is different from the two stroke line length. So looking at this particular shape right here, we see that this line here is also a diagonal line. We have two diagonal lines, and we see that in this case all four lines are not equal to each other. So since we have all this taken care of, how about that one shape that we talked about, where it is the particular shape right here, F? What we see here is that F has, in terms of the length of the lines, to be adjacent lines here that are equal in length, and these two lines here to be equal in length. And once we look at that, how about the lines that are parallel? There is no line that is parallel to each other. But now let's look at the diagonals. We see that the diagonal line here, we have one, and we have another diagonal line right here, and what we see is that these two lines are actually equal in length. And finally, looking at the angle made between the two diagonal lines, the angle made is actually 90 degrees. So we have we have three shapes right here that forms an angle diagonally that is 90 degrees to each other. So based on the conclusion here, we're going to create a mind map summary of what we gathered, not only based on the length but also the parallel lines and finally diagonal angle made. And we see here that all the shapes, they are quadrilateral because they have 4 sides and 4 angles. But then looking at it in terms of the parallel, we see here that for the first part we have 2 pairs that are parallel to each other, where we have this particular general shape where you have 2 opposite pairs that are parallel to each other, and the same as well with the length as well. And we see that we have opposite angles to be equal to each other. So in this case, this particular shape is called a parallelogram, and the parallelogram actually shares various commonalities with other shapes within that particular or quadrilateral box. One is that a specific shape with a parallelogram, or that is a parallelogram, actually is this particular shape, which is blue, and blue is called a rectangle. Reason is because it has 9 degrees formed with each of the sides interiorly, and most importantly, we see that the association with the parallelogram is that the 2 pair sides that are opposite are actually equal to each other in length. That is one thing to remember. Now the next one here is another type of parallelogram, where we see that the association with this particular shape is that the angles interiorly is not 90 degrees, it's either more or less than 90 degrees. So this particular shape is called a rhombus. Reason is because it has 4 sides that are equal to each other. However, the angle is not equal to 90 degrees, it's either more or less than 90 degrees. And finally, a particular yellow shape is actually noticed to have all 4 sides to be equal, and the angle made is actually 90 degrees interiorly everywhere, and this makes it to be a square. It is a parallelogram, of course, because all 2 opposite sides are parallel to each other. So in here, how do we associate a square to a rectangle? We see that all angles interiorly is 90 degrees to each other, and the square to a rhombus association is that all 4 sides are actually equal to each other. And now moving on to parallel, there are 2 pairs to 1 pair that is parallel. We have the one gray that is actually having one particular pair that is parallel to each other, which we notice in here. However, all these sides here length are not equal. So how do we move from all sides that are not equal to 2 sides that are opposite and equal to each other? Now this one here we notice is called a trapezoid, and this trapezoid then goes down into this particular shape that has the 2 sides to be equal, and also we have one opposite pair to be actually parallel to each other. So therefore, to have a 2 sides that are opposite to be equal, this is actually called an isosceles trapezoid, which is similar to an isosceles triangle. And finally here, looking at no pair that is actually parallel, this is actually categorized as this particular shape right here. We see that this is called a kite, and this kite here has some interesting or one important similarities with 2 other shapes right here. We see that a square, a rhombus, and a kite, they do have diagonals, 2 diagonals that forms a 90-degree angle with each other, which means that the 2 diagonals are perpendicular to each other. So that's about it for this particular segment, using the length, the parallel lines, and finally the diagonals to categorize all quadrilaterals. And let's extend our categorization of quadrilaterals to midsegments conclusion. So looking at this in here, what are midsegments? Midsegments actually comes from the median of the lines of these particular shapes right here. So the average of each line segment of any polygon, in this case the midpoint of each line, actually gives us the median, which we see right here. And then the next one here, we recognize is that every single line here, they are, once you cut them into two equal parts, it means that we have all these lines to be equal, shown by the number of lines or strokes that they share in that particular one side. And what we see is that based on that, we need to arrive at what the midsegment line is about. Now, once we're able to determine the median, the midsegment is actually the line segment that connects the midpoints of two adjacent sides of a polygon. Like for example here for B, we have this line that is connecting the median of the two adjacent sides. So in this case here, once we do the same thing for other sides here, we see here that this particular shape that is created shows that the two opposite sides length are actually equal and somewhat parallel in a way to each other as well. So the same thing is also applicable to gray. We see that we have the adjacent sides actually forming a line which is called the midsegment, and we see that while these two lines are equal in length, these two lines that are opposite to each other are actually equal in length as well for that particular gray shape right there. So in conclusion, the inside midsegment shape formed is actually forming a parallelogram. And then moving on to the next one, which is the blue and the gray E, we see that the lines that are midsegments, they have equal length, and this is also applicable in here to E. And what we see is that for E, that these lines here, which are the mid segments, they don't have equal sides. One actually has a longer side than the other, which are the pairs. We see here that I made a mistake in the second one. We have on the blue one that two opposite sides are equal in length, and the same thing is applied to E gray, which shows that the two opposite sides as well are actually equal. So in conclusion here, this actually, sorry, I take that back, I made a mistake as well. It shows here that all four sides are equal to each other. Don't forget that. So in conclusion, all four sides that are midsegments that are equal forms a rhombus. So that is it in here for the gray E and the blue shape, which is the rectangle. And the next one here is this particular kite. We see that this line and this line here, they are equal in length, and these two lines here are equal in length. So it means here that the two opposite sides are equal in length, and this is applicable as well to the green shape, which is called a rhombus. And the midsegments, they actually have two lines to be equal and the other sides two lines opposites to be equal. Therefore, a kite and a rhombus will form a rectangular midsegments. And finally here we have a square where all the midsegments actually has an equal length. And in conclusion, this means that this is actually a square that has a midsegment that forms a square. And once we're able to recognize the function of a median used to create a midsegment, we can apply this to a bimedian, which in this case is going to be used to determine a centroid. Now, we have all these shapes right here. What is a bimedian? After we've created a media, which is actually the point that equally cuts each sides, we actually know that the bimedian is actually the line that joins the midpoint of two opposite sides of a quadrilateral, which means that these are the two opposite sides. The line that is connecting those two opposite sides is called a bimedian, and in here we have two bimedians here, as well as the gray shape, as well as the rectangle shape, as we see in this other gray shape, as we see in this particular kite, as we see here in the green shape, as we see in the yellow shape right here. And what we see is that that red dot, which is where the two median meets, is actually called the centroid, which is actually the center of an object's mass, or the point at which it balances, as known as the center of gravity. Like for example, we have this particular shape, which is the red shape, and we see that this particular thread is used to balance this particular shape properly. So the region where the shape actually balances properly is actually called the center of gravity of that particular shape. That is pretty much the red dot that we see on each of these particular 6 shapes quadrilateral right here. And these are the purple lines that are surrounding the adjacent midpoints or medians are actually called the midsegments that we talked about on our previous slide right there. So that is about it for this particular video. Hope you're able to understand the function of a midsegment and how the midsegment is actually determined from the median, and how the bimedian is used to determine the centroid, and also looking at how to classify different quadrilaterals based on using not only the number or the length of the sides, but also the parallel sides, and finally the diagonal points where they meet. So all the same, thanks for following me through this. Truly appreciate it. Please look at the worksheets that are given to you, and also assignment 7, which is an option, and this is due on June 16th. And please reach out to me if you have any questions, either through my email or through Google Meet, so that we can actually clear things up in a smooth and intelligent way. All the same, stay smart and always believe in yourselves.